Jiho saw the smoke first, and that was never a good sign on an asteroid mining station, where everything depended on sealed environments and recycled air. So he grabbed his emergency medical kit and ran toward the outer perimeter, where the smoke seemed to be coming from, his boots clanging against the metal walkways as alarms started blaring throughout. Cheonan 7 station, and he could hear Hyun's voice over the comm system telling everyone to stay calm and remain at their posts while the security team investigated the disturbance, but Jiho kept running, because he was the only real doctor on this rock, and if someone was hurt, they would need him fast. The crash site was about 200 meters outside the main dome in a crater that hadn't been there yesterday, and Jiho could see the twisted metal of what looked like a small scout ship embedded in the asteroid's surface, still glowing red from atmospheric entry, even though there wasn't much atmosphere out here to speak of, and he quickly checked his suit's oxygen levels before stepping through the airlock into the void where the stars blazed cold and endless above him. He approached carefully because alien ships could be dangerous even when they were wrecked, and he had no idea what species this vessel belonged to or whether they would be friendly or hostile to humans. But his medical training overrode his caution when he saw movement near the wreckage and realized someone was still alive in there. So he activated his suit's external speakers and called out that he was a doctor and here to help. The response came in a language he didn't understand at first, harsh and clicking. But his suit's translator kicked in after a moment and converted the words to something he could process. "Stay back. Don't come closer. I will defend myself if you approach." Jiho stopped and raised his hands to show he meant no harm, and told the injured person that he could see they were bleeding and needed medical attention, or they would die out here in the cold and dark. And after a long pause, the voice came again, weaker this time, asking what species he was, and when he said human, there was another pause. Before the voice said something that sounded like resignation, he found her half buried in the cockpit wreckage, and she was definitely not human. With scaled skin that shimmered between green and silver, and eyes that were too large and had vertical pupils like a cat, and there was purple blood leaking from multiple wounds across her torso where something had torn through both her suit and her flesh beneath. Jiho didn't hesitate because a patient was a patient regardless of what they looked like. So he carefully extracted her from the wreckage and sealed the worst of the suit breaches with emergency foam before activating his stretcher drone and getting her back to the station as quickly as he could while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Hyun was waiting at the airlock, and he looked worried, telling Jiho that bringing an unknown alien onto the station could create all kinds of political problems, especially given the current tensions between humanity and some of the other coalition species. But Jiho just pushed past him and headed straight for the medical bay, because he wasn't going to let someone die for politics. The medical bay was small but well-equipped, and Jiho had treated enough different species during his years as a combat surgeon to know the basics of xenobiology, so he got the alien woman onto the examination table and started cutting away the damaged parts of her suit to expose the wounds beneath, while his diagnostic scanner hummed and beeped, trying to figure out what species she was and what her baseline vital signs should be. The scanner came back with a match. Velthara, one of the older and more advanced species in the Galactic Coalition, known for their military prowess and their generally low opinion of humanity as newcomers who didn't understand how the galaxy really worked. That made this situation even more complicated, but Jiho focused on the medicine because that was what he could control, and the wounds were bad. Deep plasma burns that had cauterized as they were made but still caused massive tissue damage, plus at least 3 broken ribs and probable internal bleeding in what he assumed were her lungs. Based on the way she was breathing, he worked quickly and efficiently, injecting her with a broad-spectrum painkiller that should work on most carbon-based life forms, and then starting to clean and treat the burns while muttering to himself, the way he always did when he was concentrating, talking through the procedure to keep his mind focused and his hand steady. The problem with plasma burns is that they destroy tissue at the cellular level, and you can't just stitch them up like a regular wound. You have to debride all the dead tissue and then encourage regeneration with growth factors, and hope the patient's own healing ability is strong enough to take over. And Jiho knew that Velthara physiology was pretty robust, probably more so than human physiology. In some ways, although humans had their own advantages, when it came to healing, he found himself saying out loud that her pain tolerance must be incredible because she hadn't made a sound even when he was cleaning the worst of the burns, and that reminded him of the soldiers he'd treated during the wars, the ones who'd been through so much that they'd learned to disconnect from their bodies and just endure whatever came. Then he started comparing her cellular structure to human cellular structure based on what the scanner was showing him and noting that her regeneration rate was actually slower than what he would expect, which was interesting because humans had unusually fast healing for a species at their development level, probably because of all the genetic modifications that had been made during the dark years when survival meant adapting faster than the threats could kill you. The alien woman's eyes flickered open and focused on him with surprising clarity for someone who should be deep under sedation, and Jiho realized she'd been listening to everything he was saying. He kept working because he needed to finish treating the internal injuries before they became critical, using a tissue regenerator to seal the damaged lung tissue and inject a cocktail of antibiotics and healing factors directly into the wound sites. And he was muttering again about how this reminded him of treating chemical weapon exposure victims back when humans were still fighting each other with banned weapons, before they figured out that extinction was a real possibility if they kept going down that road. The Velthara woman made a sound, and Jiho looked up to see her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between confusion and alarm. And he realized too late that he'd just referenced things that weren't supposed to be part of humanity's official history. As far as the Coalition knew, he tried to cover by saying something vague about medical school case studies, but he could tell she wasn't buying it. Her alien eyes were too intelligent and too focused, despite the pain she must still be feeling, and he knew he'd made a mistake. The medical bay door opened and Mireille came in, the young mining engineer who was always too curious for her own good, and she stopped when she saw the alien patient and then looked at Jiho with wide eyes. Mireille asked if he realized what he'd just been saying out loud in front of a Coalition military officer, because that's what the insignia on the alien's torn suit indicated she was. And Jiho felt his stomach drop because no, he hadn't noticed the rank markers. He'd been too focused on keeping her alive to pay attention to who she actually was. The Velthara woman tried to sit up and Jiho gently pushed her back down, telling her she needed to rest because her injuries were severe and she'd lost a lot of blood. But she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and said in perfectly clear human language that she wanted to know what he'd meant about chemical weapons and regenerative medicine and why humans would have experience with those things when they're official. History said they'd been peaceful explorers for the past 200 years. Jiho didn't have a good answer for that, and before he could think of something to say, Hyun's voice came over the comm system, tight with tension, telling Jiho to report to his office immediately, because the Coalition had detected the crash and they were sending an inspection team to investigate, and they wanted to know why a Velthara military scout had gone down near a human mining operation. The alien woman smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression, and she said quietly that this was about to get very interesting for everyone involved, especially for the humans who seemed to have secrets they didn't want the galaxy to know about. Jiho looked at Mireille and then at his patient and then at the medical readouts that showed she was stable enough to survive for now. And he wondered how a simple rescue mission had suddenly turned into a potential diplomatic incident that could expose things about humanity that were supposed to stay buried forever in the dark past where they belonged. Aaron woke 12 hours later and immediately assessed her situation with the cold precision of someone who'd been trained to evaluate threats from the moment consciousness returned, and she noted that she was in a human medical facility that was surprisingly well equipped, that her wounds had been treated competently, and that the human doctor who'd saved her life was sitting in a chair beside her bed, looking like he hadn't slept at all. Jiho noticed she was awake and offered her water, which she accepted because her throat felt like she'd been breathing vacuum, even though she knew that wasn't quite what had happened, and she drank slowly while watching him with the kind of attention that made most beings uncomfortable, because Velthara eyes were designed to track prey, and that instinct didn't go away just because you became civilized. She asked him directly what he'd meant about chemical weapons and regenerative medicine, and why he'd talked about those things like they were common knowledge when every Velthara intelligence briefing said that humans were a young species that had only recently achieved peaceful unification before venturing into space. Jiho tried to deflect, saying he must have been confused or that she'd misheard him through the translation, but Aaron had perfect recall of everything that had happened while she was on that medical table, and she told him so, explaining that Velthara biology included enhanced memory as part of their survival adaptations, and she remembered every single word he'd said, He looked trapped and uncomfortable, and that told her more than any words could have, because innocent beings didn't look like that when asked simple questions about medical procedures, and she pressed harder, asking why he'd compared her healing rate to human healing rate as if humans had unusually fast regeneration when that wasn't mentioned in any of the official biological profiles the Coalition had on his species. Jiho stood up and checked her vital signs, clearly trying to buy time to think, and he told her she should rest and recover her strength before worrying about complicated questions. But Erin had been a military intelligence officer before she became a scout pilot, and she knew evasion. When she saw it, she explained to him that her species had been part of the Galactic Coalition for over 8,000 years, and in that time, they'd encountered hundreds of other species at various stages of development. And one thing they'd learned was how to read the signs of a civilization's history in the way its people talked about survival and adaptation and necessity. Humans, according to Coalition records, had achieved space travel only 400 years ago and had joined the Coalition just 200 years after that, presenting themselves as a species that had overcome its differences through philosophy and mutual understanding, with no major wars in their recent history and no experience with the kinds of weapons that the older species had long since banned. But the way Jiho had talked while treating her wounds didn't match that profile at all, because he'd spoken about biological warfare and genetic adaptation and regenerative medicine with the casual familiarity of someone whose entire species had been shaped by those things, not as abstract concepts, but as lived reality that had been passed down through generations. Jiho finally sat back down and looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as the face of someone caught between competing duties, and he asked her quietly what she planned to do with her suspicions. Erin considered that question carefully, because it was more complicated than it seemed, and she told him that officially, she should report everything to her superiors, who would then investigate and determine whether humanity had violated any Coalition regulations by falsifying their historical records. But unofficially, she was curious about why a species would go to such lengths to hide their past. He asked if her curiosity was stronger than her duty, and she admitted she wasn't sure yet. But she wanted to understand what she was dealing with before making any decisions, because in her experience, the beings who lied about their history usually had very good reasons, either because they were ashamed of what they'd been or because they were afraid of how others would react. The door opened and Hyun entered, bringing with him the stern authority of someone who'd been dealing with bureaucrats all morning, and he told Erin that the Coalition inspection team would arrive within 48 hours, and that she would need to be available for debriefing about what had caused her ship to crash. Erin acknowledged this with a slight nod and asked Hyun if he knew what his medical officer had revealed during her treatment, and the way Hyun's expression tightened told her that yes, he knew, and no, he wasn't happy about it. Hyun looked at Jiho with disappointment and frustration and said they would talk later about operational security and the importance of keeping personal knowledge separate from professional duties. Then he left to continue coordinating the station's response to the impending inspection. Erin and Jiho sat in silence for a while, and she used that time to study him more carefully, noting the scars on his hands that suggested military surgery experience, the way he held himself with the controlled tension of someone who'd seen combat, and the grief in his eyes that spoke of losses that went beyond normal medical failures. She told him she'd been reviewing her ship's logs before the crash, and that she'd been pursuing a pirate vessel that had been raiding Coalition supply lines, and the pirates had damaged her engines with a weapon that shouldn't have existed anymore, something that used quantum disruption technology that had been banned 3,000 years ago. Jiho's expression changed when she mentioned that, and he asked her how pirates could possibly have access to weapons that advanced. And Erin said that was an excellent question that her superiors had been trying to answer for months, but the working theory was that someone was supplying them with technology from restricted archives. She watched his reaction carefully and saw the moment when he made a connection that troubled him, and she asked what he was thinking. Jiho hesitated again, but then seemed to decide that the truth was less dangerous than speculation, and he told her that if someone had access to restricted archives from 3,000 years ago, then they might also have access to records about species that had been removed from Coalition history, civilizations that had been deemed too dangerous or unstable to be allowed into the modern galactic community. Erin felt something cold settle in her chest because that possibility had implications she didn't want to consider, and she asked him directly if humanity was one of those removed species, if humans had actually been in space far longer than their official records claimed. Jiho didn't answer with words, but his silence was answer enough, and Erin found herself recalculating everything she thought she knew about the beings who shared this station with her. She asked how long, and Jiho said more than 800 years, and she asked why they'd hidden it, and he said because the alternative was being quarantined or destroyed by species that couldn't accept what humanity had been during those early centuries. Erin demanded to know what humanity had been, and Jiho closed his eyes for a long moment before opening them again and saying they'd been survivors, the kind that did whatever was necessary to keep existing, even when that meant becoming monsters. The medical bay felt smaller suddenly, and Erin realized she was having trouble breathing, not from her injuries, but from the weight of understanding what she was being told. And she asked if humans had committed genocide. Jiho's voice was quiet and steady when he said yes, twice against 2 other species that humanity had encountered during their early expansion, and both times it had been justified as necessary for human survival. But really it had been fear and aggression and the absolute certainty that the universe was hostile, and only the strong would survive. Erin had to process that information and reconcile it with the fact that this same species had then somehow transformed itself into the peaceful explorers who'd petitioned to join the coalition, and she asked how that was even possible. Jiho explained that humanity had nearly destroyed itself in a civil war that lasted 50 years, a conflict between those who wanted to continue the path of conquest and those who believed there had to be a better way, and the reformers had won, but the cost had been billions of lives and the complete restructuring of human government and culture. The door opened again, and this time it was Mirai who entered, carrying a data pad and looking worried, and she told them both that she'd found something in the station's historical archives, old transmission records that someone had tried to erase but hadn't quite deleted completely. Mirai showed them the data, and Erin saw references to human colonies that dated back far earlier than the official timeline, along with fragmentary reports about conflicts with species she didn't recognize and weapon signatures that matched banned technology. Hyun's voice came over the comm again, sounding even more tense than before, and he told Jiho that the coalition inspector had sent ahead a list of questions they wanted answered, and most of those questions were about human medical capabilities and genetic modification programs and historical records of human expansion. Hyun's quarters were small but private, with walls that blocked all external sensors and a door that locked with codes only he knew, and Jiho helped Erin settle into a chair, while Mirai set up a data terminal that she'd disconnected from the station network, so there would be no record of what they were about to discuss. Erin looked at the 3 humans and saw different expressions on each face. Hyun showed resignation, Mirai showed nervous excitement, and Jiho showed the kind of weariness that came from carrying a burden too long, and she told them to begin because the clock was counting down to the inspection team's arrival. Jiho started talking, and once he began, he couldn't seem to stop, words pouring out like a dam had broken, and he told her about Earth's 21st century when humanity had nearly ended itself through climate collapse and resource wars and the development of biological weapons that killed with horrifying efficiency. He explained how the survivors had been changed by those weapons, not just psychologically but genetically, because the only humans who lived through the plagues were the ones whose bodies could adapt faster than the diseases could mutate, and that had triggered a cascade of forced evolution that normally would have taken millions of years, but instead happened in just a few generations. Erin listened and tried to imagine what that must have been like. Entire populations dying while a small percentage developed immunity and passed those traits to their children, and she asked how humanity had survived long enough to reach space. Jiho said they'd survived through desperation and brilliance in equal measure, developing genetic modification technology not for enhancement, but for basic survival, learning to edit their own DNA to resist the weapons they'd created, and eventually emerging from the dark period with a population that was fundamentally different from the humans who'd started the century. Mirai added details from the historical records she'd uncovered, explaining that the early space expansion had been driven by the need to escape Earth's contaminated environment and find new worlds where humanity could start fresh, but they'd carried their trauma with them, and when they encountered other species they'd reacted with fear and aggression. The first contact had been with a species called the Dorani, peaceful beings who'd been exploring the outer edges of their own solar system when human colony ships arrived, and the initial meeting had gone well until a human diplomat had been exposed to what turned out to be a harmless Dorani bacteria and died from an allergic reaction. Humanity had interpreted this as an attack, and the response had been swift and brutal, with human ships destroying Dorani settlements and spreading biological agents specifically designed to target Dorani physiology. And within 6 months the Dorani were extinct. Aaron felt sick hearing this because the Dorani were listed in Coalition archives as a lost civilization, one of the tragic species that had destroyed themselves before achieving stable space travel. And now she was learning that actually, they'd been murdered by humans who were too damaged to recognize peaceful contact. Jiho's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking as he continued the story, telling her about the second genocide against a species called the Vren, who'd tried to defend their territory against human expansion, and how humanity had justified it as necessary for survival, even though by that point they had plenty of resources and weren't actually under threat. He explained that it was during the Vren War that some humans finally started questioning what they were becoming, and a resistance movement formed that believed humanity needed to change fundamentally or they would eventually destroy themselves and take other species with them. The civil war that followed lasted 50 years and killed more humans than both genocides combined, and it only ended when the reformers developed a weapon that could target specific genetic markers that were common in the conquest faction, essentially wiping out everyone who carried certain aggressive traits that had been enhanced during the survival period. Aaron asked if that meant modern humans were genetically different from their ancestors, and Jiho confirmed it, saying that all humans alive today were descended from the survivors of the reformist purge, beings who'd been selected for cooperation and empathy rather than aggression. But he also admitted that those aggressive traits hadn't been completely removed, just suppressed, and every human still carried the genetic memory of what their species had been capable of when pushed to extremes. Hyun spoke for the first time and explained the political situation, how the reformed human government had made the decision to hide their true history and present themselves as a young species when they finally made contact with the Galactic Coalition, because they believed honestly would result in humanity being quarantined or destroyed. Mireille showed them data about how the cover-up had been implemented, with entire colonies being relocated to make it look like human expansion had only started 400 years ago, and historical records being altered or destroyed to remove evidence of the early genocides. And the Civil War. Aaron processed all of this and found herself struggling with conflicting emotions because on one hand humanity had committed atrocities that should never be forgotten or forgiven, but on the other hand they'd also fundamentally transformed themselves in ways that most species never managed. She asked the crucial question: was the transformation real, or had humans just learned to hide their nature better? Jiho said he'd believed it was real, that humanity had genuinely become better, but he admitted he couldn't be completely certain, because the capacity for violence was still there in every human's DNA, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge again. Aaron stood up carefully, testing her healing injuries, and walked to the window where she could see the stars beyond the station, and she told them something she'd never shared with anyone outside her own species. The Velthara had their own hidden history, a period 8,000 years ago when they'd been every bit as violent and aggressive as humans, when they'd conquered and destroyed and justified it all as necessary for their survival and greatness. Her species had eventually evolved past that period, developing the philosophical and cultural frameworks that allowed them to become the peaceful civilization they were now, but it had taken millennia and several near-extinction events before they finally changed. The difference was that the Velthara had been allowed time to let the galaxy forget their dark age, because it had happened so long ago that no other current species remembered it, and their transformation had been gradual rather than forced. Humans hadn't had that luxury because they'd been discovered before enough time had passed, and now they were trapped between their past and their present with no clear path forward. Aaron turned back to face them and asked what they thought would happen. If the Coalition learned the truth, Hyun said the best-case scenario was quarantine, with humanity restricted to their current worlds and forbidden from expanding further, and the worst case was preemptive military action to prevent humans from becoming a threat again. Mireille argued that wasn't fair because humanity had changed and deserved a chance to prove themselves. But Aaron pointed out that from the Coalition's perspective, humans represented an unknown risk, a species that had committed genocide twice and then hidden the evidence, and that wasn't the kind of neighbor most beings wanted. Jiho asked Aaron what she was going to tell the inspectors, and she said she didn't know yet, because she was still trying to decide whether protecting humanity's secret was the right thing to do or whether the galaxy deserved to know what they were dealing with. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from Hyun's terminal, and when he checked it, his face went pale, and he told them that the Coalition inspector had arrived early and was demanding access to the station's medical records and personnel files immediately. Mireille quickly disconnected her data terminal and wiped its memory while Jiho helped Aaron stand. And they all understood that whatever was about to happen would determine not just their individual fates, but potentially the future of human-alien relations. Throughout the galaxy, Aaron made a split-second decision and told Hyun to give the inspector limited access to the medical bay, but to delay releasing any detailed records until she had a chance to speak with them first, because she needed to see how they conducted themselves before deciding what to reveal. Hyun looked surprised but agreed, and he asked why she was helping them when she had every reason to expose humanity's lies. Aaron said it wasn't about helping humanity. It was about making sure that if she did expose them, it would be for the right reasons based on who they were now, rather than who they'd been centuries ago, and she couldn't make that judgment without more information. As they prepared to meet the inspector, Jiho pulled Aaron aside and thanked her for listening even if she ultimately decided to reveal everything. And he told her that regardless of what happened, he was glad he'd saved her life because she deserved to know the truth. Rather than living with comfortable lies, Aaron asked him if humans had a concept of redemption, and Jiho said they did. But it was complicated because redemption required both acknowledgement of past wrongs and concrete evidence of change, and humanity had failed the first part by hiding their history. Aaron told Kelris that before he made any official reports, he needed to understand the full context of the situation, and she could see his suspicion immediately because Coalition inspectors weren't used to being told what they needed to do, especially by someone who was technically under investigation themselves. Kelris said that context didn't matter when regulations had been violated, and he had evidence that humans possessed medical knowledge that exceeded their official development timeline, which suggested either they'd stolen technology from other species or they'd falsified their historical records when joining the Coalition. Aaron chose her words carefully and explained that both possibilities were wrong, but the truth was more complicated than simple violation of rules, and she asked him whether the Coalition valued accuracy more than convenience, because what she was about to tell him would challenge some fundamental assumptions. The inspector's compound eyes reflected the medical bay lights in strange patterns, and he said the Coalition was built on accurate information, and any species that provided false data was subject to sanctions up to and including expulsion or quarantine. So if Aaron had evidence of human dishonesty, she was required to share it immediately. She asked him a different question instead. Had he ever wondered why the Coalition's founding species all seemed to have such similar histories of peaceful development and philosophical enlightenment, when basic probability suggested that intelligent life should emerge in many different forms with many different paths to civilization? Kelris said that was irrelevant speculation, and he wanted facts, not philosophy. But Aaron could see she'd planted a seed of doubt, because he was intelligent enough to recognize a valid question, even when he didn't want to consider its implications. Aaron explained that during her treatment, Jiho had made comments that revealed knowledge about biological warfare and genetic adaptation that humans shouldn't possess according to their official timeline, and yes, this suggested their history was incomplete or inaccurate. But before Kelris reported that he should ask himself why a species would hide such information, the inspector said the reason didn't matter because deception was deception regardless of motivation, and the Coalition had to be able to trust that member species were honest about their capabilities and history. Aaron agreed in principle but pointed out that the Coalition's rules assumed all species had equal opportunity to develop peacefully, when in fact some species face circumstances that force them to make terrible choices just to survive. And perhaps humanity's hidden history reflected those kinds of choices. Kelris was losing patience, and he told Aaron directly that if she was defending human deception, she was violating her own oath as a Coalition military officer, and he would have no choice but to include her in his investigation and report. Before Aaron could respond, Mirai burst into the medical bay carrying her datapad and looking frightened. And she told them that she'd found something else in the station's archives, encrypted files that shouldn't have been accessible, but she'd managed to crack the security. Kelris immediately demanded to see whatever Mirai had found, and she hesitated, looking at Aaron and then at Jiho, who had just entered behind her, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Mirai showed them the files and Aaron felt her world tilt because what she was seeing were coalition records, official documents that dated back thousands of years, and they detailed something called the cleansing protocols, which had been used by the founding species to eliminate civilizations deemed too dangerous or unstable to join the galactic community. The records listed 12 species that had been destroyed, not through war but through systematic isolation and resource denial until they collapsed. And each case included justifications about protecting the greater good and preventing potential threats before they could fully develop. Kelris tried to grab the datapad, but Mirai pulled it back and said she'd already sent copies to secure locations throughout the station, and if anything happened to her or the others, the files would automatically be broadcast on all frequencies. The inspector's entire body language changed, and he told Mirai that she'd just committed a serious crime by accessing classified coalition materials, and he would have her detained immediately for violating security protocols. Aaron stepped between them and said that Kelris needed to think very carefully about his next actions because if those files were authentic, then the coalition had built its entire moral authority on a foundation of hidden genocides, and exposing humanity's past while hiding the coalition's own crimes would be hypocrisy of the highest order. Kelris said the situations weren't comparable because the cleansing protocols had been necessary to protect developing civilizations from aggressive species, while humanity had committed violence out of fear and expansionism. Jiho spoke for the first time, and his voice was cold when he said that every genocide in history had been justified by its perpetrators as necessary, and the fact that the coalition had institutionalized the practice just made it worse, not better. The argument was interrupted by Hyun's voice over the comm system, announcing that a coalition military vessel had just entered the system and was demanding permission to dock, and from his tone it was clear this wasn't a routine visit. Kelris looked satisfied and said he'd called for backup as soon as he'd found the anomalies in the medical records, and now proper authorities would handle the situation, including detaining all the humans for questioning. Aaron made a decision that went against every regulation she'd ever followed, and she told Kelris that she couldn't allow him to report any of this until they'd established what the truth actually was. Not just about humanity, but about the coalition itself. The inspector said she was committing treason and her career was over, but Aaron pointed out that her career had been over the moment she'd started asking questions that threatened the established narrative, and at this point she cared more about finding out what was real than protecting her position. Mirai suggested they contact the incoming military vessel directly and present all the evidence they had, both about humanity's hidden history and about the coalition's cleansing protocols, and let whoever commanded that ship decide what to do with the information. Hyun said that was incredibly risky because they had no way of knowing whether the ship's commander would be sympathetic or would simply carry out orders to silence everyone who knew too much. Jiho pointed out that they were out of good options and the only choice left was between hiding the truth and hoping for the best or revealing everything and forcing the issue into the open, where it couldn't be quietly buried. Aaron accessed the station's communication system using her military codes and opened a channel to the incoming vessel, and she was surprised to hear a familiar voice respond because the ship was commanded by Admiral Kieran, who had been her mentor and commanding officer before she'd transferred to scout operations. Kieran. His voice was stern when he asked Aaron to explain why she was interfering with a coalition inspection and why Inspector Kelris had reported that she was defending human violations of membership protocols. Aaron took a deep breath and told Kieran that she needed him to review certain files before making any decisions about how to proceed, and she transmitted copies of both the human historical records that Jiho had shared and the coalition cleansing protocol documents that Mirai had uncovered. There was a long silence, and Aaron could imagine Kieran reviewing the information with the same careful attention he brought to everything. And she knew he would understand the implications immediately because he was one of the most intelligent beings she'd ever known. When Kieran spoke again, his voice had changed, and he asked Erin if she was certain the documents were authentic. And she said she'd verified the human records through multiple sources, and the coalition files had encryption signatures that matched official archives. Kieran said he needed to think about this and he would be docking in 30 minutes. And until then, everyone was to remain exactly where they were and not communicate with anyone. Outside the station, Kelrus protested that the Admiral was exceeding his authority and should simply follow protocol by detaining the suspects and securing the evidence. But Kieran cut him off and said that protocol assumed they were dealing with a simple violation rather than a systemic problem that might require fundamental reevaluation of coalition principles. After the channel closed, Erin sat down because her injuries were catching up with her, and she felt exhausted not just physically but emotionally from the weight of everything she'd learned. Jiho came over and checked her vital signs, his doctor instincts overriding the political crisis. And he told her quietly that regardless of what happened next, he appreciated what she was trying to do. Erin said she wasn't sure she was trying to help humanity specifically, but rather trying to force honesty into a system that had been built on selective truth. And maybe that would benefit everyone, or maybe it would cause chaos, but at least it would be genuine. Mirai was still working on her data pad, and she suddenly made a sound of distress. And when the others asked what was wrong, she showed them another file she'd found, this one from Earth's diplomatic corps. Admiral Kieran's decision to call for a special coalition council session set off reactions across the entire galaxy, because word spread quickly that something unprecedented was happening. And within hours, every major species had dispatched representatives, while smaller civilizations waited anxiously to learn what crisis could possibly require such urgent attention. The station became the center of galactic focus, and Hyun found himself coordinating the arrival of dozens of ships while trying to maintain normal operations. And Mirai worked constantly to prepare data presentations that would show all the evidence they'd gathered in the clearest possible format. Jiho spent his time caring for Erin, whose injuries still required monitoring, and they talked about what was coming and whether the galaxy was ready for the truth they were about to reveal. Erin said her species had a saying that translated roughly to sunlight kills infection, meaning that exposing problems was the first step toward healing them, and she believed the coalition needed this exposure, even if the process would be painful. Kelrus remained confined to quarters under Kieran's authority, and he'd stopped protesting once he realized the Admiral was serious about forcing a confrontation. But everyone knew he would report everything to his superiors, and there would be political consequences regardless of how the council session went. 3 days after Kieran's announcement, the council convened in a hastily prepared chamber aboard a neutral diplomatic vessel that had been equipped with translation systems for all the attending species, and representatives from 47 civilizations filled the space with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Kieran opened the session by explaining that evidence had emerged suggesting fundamental dishonesty in how certain species, including humanity, had presented their histories, but also evidence that the coalition itself had engaged in practices that contradicted its stated principles. The chamber erupted in protests and demands for clarification, and it took several minutes for order to be restored before Kieran could continue. He presented the human records first, showing the timeline of Earth's actual space expansion and the evidence of genocides committed during the early period, and the reaction was immediate, with many species calling for humanity's expulsion and others demanding military action to contain what they saw as a threat. The human delegation tried to defend themselves by explaining the context of survival and fear, but their arguments fell flat because genocide couldn't be justified regardless of circumstances, and Jiho watched from the observers section as everything he'd feared began to unfold. Then Kieran presented the second set of evidence: the coalition's cleansing protocols and the records of 12 civilizations that had been systematically destroyed by the founding species under the justification of protecting galactic stability. The chamber fell silent as representatives processed what they were seeing. And then the silence broke into chaos that was even worse than before, because these weren't accusations against a single species, but against the entire foundation of coalition. Governance. One of the elder species representatives tried to dismiss the Yao cleansing protocols as necessary actions taken during a different era when the rules of civilization weren't yet established. But Aaron stood and challenged this by pointing out that the last cleansing had occurred only 3,000 years ago, well after the coalition had been founded on principles of peaceful coexistence. Another representative argued that comparing humanity's crimes to the coalition's protective measures was false equivalence because the cleansings had been carried out to prevent greater harm. But Jiho was given permission to speak, and he said that was exactly how humanity had justified their genocides, by claiming they were preventing future threats. The debate raged for hours with no clear resolution emerging, and it became obvious that the galaxy was dividing into factions: those who believed humanity should be punished for deception, those who thought the coalition's hypocrisy was the greater crime, and those who wanted to find some middle path that addressed both issues. Mireille had prepared a third presentation that she'd been holding back, and she requested permission to show it now because she believed it was relevant to the discussion. What she revealed was a comprehensive analysis of every species in the coalition and their historical records, and she'd found gaps and inconsistencies in almost every civilization's official timeline, suggesting that humanity wasn't unique in having hidden parts of their past. Some species had covered up wars of conquest, others had erased evidence of environmental disasters they'd caused through negligence, and several had simply omitted periods of internal conflict that didn't fit their preferred narrative of steady, peaceful progress. The implications were staggering, because if every species had engaged in some level of historical revision, then the entire coalition was built on mutual comfortable lies rather than honest acknowledgement of universal flaws. One representative stood and said this was irrelevant distraction from the specific crime of human genocide. But another countered that it showed humanity's real crime was being caught, rather than being uniquely evil. Kieran called for order and proposed something radical. Instead of punishing humanity specifically, the coalition should institute a new policy of historical transparency, where all species were required to acknowledge their full past, including the parts they weren't proud of. The proposal sparked intense debate because many species didn't want to expose their own secrets, but others recognized that continuing the pattern of selective truth would only create more problems in the future. Aaron requested permission to speak, and she shared her own species' hidden history of violence and conquest, explaining that the Velthara had committed atrocities 8,000 years ago but had been allowed to forget them because they'd had time for the galaxy to move on. She argued that humanity's real crime wasn't being worse than other species but being younger and therefore having less time for their mistakes to fade into comfortable distance. And perhaps the solution wasn't to punish them for honesty, but to create a framework where all species could acknowledge their pasts without fear of destruction. Representative from a small species that had only recently joined the coalition stood and said they appreciated this discussion because they'd been terrified their own hidden history would be discovered and used against them, and knowing that even the elder species had dark pasts made them feel less alone. That comment seemed to shift something in the chamber, and more representatives began sharing their own species' secrets, creating a cascade of confession that was painful but also strangely liberating. Kelrus tried to interrupt and argue that this was all undermining the authority and stability of the coalition, but Kieran said that authority built on lies wasn't worth maintaining, and stability that required ignorance wasn't true peace. The session continued for 3 more days with breaks for rest and consultation, and gradually a consensus began to emerge. The coalition would not expel humanity, but would place them under probationary status while implementing new transparency requirements for all member species. Additionally, the cleansing protocols would be formally abolished, and a historical reconciliation commission would be established to investigate and acknowledge all past atrocities committed by coalition members. It wasn't a perfect solution, and many species remained angry or frightened by the revelations, but it was a start toward building something more honest than what had existed before. When the final vote came, the measure passed with significant majority support, and humanity remained part of the coalition, though their relationship with other species would be complicated for years to come. Jiho felt strange relief when he heard the results because he'd expected much worse, and he realized that sometimes the bravest thing a civilization could do was admit its flaws and ask others to judge them honestly. Aaron found him after the session ended, and she told him she was resigning from military service to join the new Reconciliation Commission and she asked if he would consider doing the same. Because they needed beings who understood both the importance of truth and the complexity of forgiveness. Jiho said he'd spent 15 years trying to hide from his species' past, and maybe it was time to spend the next 15 helping to acknowledge it, so he agreed to join her. Hyun was promoted to regional coordinator for human-alien cooperation programs, and Cheonan 7 became a symbol of the kind of honest dialogue that the new coalition wanted to encourage. Mirai became the youngest member of the Galactic Transparency Initiative, and she spent her time helping species uncover and share their hidden histories. 6 months later, Jiho was treating a minor injury Aaron had sustained during a diplomatic mission that had gotten more physical than expected. And as he worked, he found himself talking through the procedure the way he always did. Aaron smiled and reminded him that his casual comments about human medical knowledge were what had started this entire cascade of revelations, and she asked if he regretted being so careless with his words. Jiho said he'd spent a long time thinking about that, and he'd realized his subconscious had wanted the truth to come out, that carrying the weight